No. Hi, everyone. This week we are going to start digging into the literary works themselves. And one of the works that I find particularly useful, really regardless of what class I'm teaching, one of the works I find to be very useful to start with is the very short story. It's about a page. Kate Chopin's The Story of an Hour. Now, I have posted to week two materials, so this is in your course documents. I've posted what you see up in front of you now, which is essentially a very quick guide on how to analyze a work of literature and some of the basic terms that we use to do that. This is not exhaustive, and if you want more thorough definitions of some of these terms, you can also look, there's a glossary of literary terms in your Bedford text that you can consult anytime. Now, I'm not going to go over all of these. I'll let you read them on your own. But essentially, this is what I want you to think about in terms of how you start to tackle these works, especially a story. One of the things that you need to do is first, of course, figure out what the plot is, okay? And the plot really just refers to what happened, the sequence or arrangement of events in the story. And we're all very good at understanding plot. And I think if you took The Story of an Hour, you could probably distill the plot down into a few sentences, right? Woman finds out that husband dies, woman goes upstairs, feels a tremendous sense of relief and freedom, starts thinking about her life in the future without him, goes back downstairs, sees that he's alive, and she dies. I mean, that's essentially the plot. And so the question you want to ask first is, well, why is the author, in this case Chopin, why is the author writing the story? I mean, you can tell anybody what happens, but what's the point? In other words, what's the central meaning of the story, or what's the message it's trying to convey? And that really refers to the theme. And stories, novels, and so forth, they can have lots of different themes at once. So I don't mean to suggest that there is a theme and that you must identify that theme or it's wrong. But I think in this story, just go with me. Even if you identify a different theme, let's say that if you're reading this, you agree with me that one of the themes, anyway, of this story is the oppressive nature of marriage, at least at this time, particularly from the woman's perspective. And so if you think to yourself, okay, this is kind of what the story is doing, then the next thing you need to do is say, well, what are the various things that Chopin is doing with the story to reinforce that, even if it's not obvious at first? So what you do is you think, okay, well, what is the plot? And then what are all these other details there for? In other words, why does she include these descriptions of the trees, of the windows, and so forth, the seasons, where the sun is setting? You don't need any of that to understand the basic plot, but she's including these added elements, these images, descriptions, details, because as I hope you'll start to see here and elsewhere, that she's actually reinforcing and commenting on what the central theme is. Now, there are lots of, even in a story like this, I could probably talk for 2 hours. But one of the things that you should pay attention to in The Story of an Hour, and actually a lot of the stories that you're going to read, is the use of names. Now, one of the things you might notice is that for most of the story, all of the characters get first names except for the main character, the protagonist, Mrs. Mallard. So for most of the story anyway, as everybody else gets a first name, she gets Mrs. and Mallard. And so if you're with me that one of the themes is the sort of oppressive nature of marriage from the woman's perspective, then you can see how repeating the Mrs., which the Mrs. part sort of indicates that she's married, the Mallard really especially then would have indicated what his last name was, but neither of these names really belongs to her. It's not until she goes upstairs, feels this sense of freedom and relief, and thinks about living life for herself, then and only then does Chopin, the author, allow us to know what her first name is, Louise. And so, in a sense, when she's being named corresponds with when she actually starts to get her own identity. At least she believes she's getting her own identity. That's not an accident. Neither is the name itself. And I won't spend a lot of time on this, but why Mallard? Why not Smith? Why not Nielsen? Lots of names that could work here. Why would Chopin choose Mallard? And I think there are lots of ways you could approach this. I mean, I've had students, point out obviously that a mallard is a duck, right? One of the things you'll notice about the story is that it moves up and down, right? When she thinks she's free of her husband in this marriage, she goes up the steps. And then when she comes down, right, that's where she realizes that she's not. That's an interesting use of setting. But a lot of the story is about ascending, right? She's upstairs as she's experiencing this. She's seeing the tops of the trees. She's seeing the birds in the sky. And so this idea of ascending seems really important to freedom. And so that sort of corresponds with birds. I had one student sort of suggest once, and I like this idea, that why else a mallard? Why a duck instead of some other bird? And one student once said, well, as you read the story, you realize that although everything about her life seems like it's going well to all the other characters, she's got all of the sort of tumultuousness and she's unsettled underneath. And maybe you could compare that to the way you see a duck on the surface of the water, where it looks very placid and calm as it moves along, but what you don't see are the little legs churning underneath. Maybe the same idea that there's something beneath the surface. All of those are interesting, but I think one of the reasons clearly that Chopin chose the name was Mallard. If you do the sort of etymology of it through the Old French and Latin, it ultimately ends up deriving from the word male or man. And so if you think about how this is a story about the sort of oppressive nature of marriage, especially from the female perspective, and calling her sort of Mrs. Man, reinforcing the sort of male element, becomes symbolically relevant. And so pay attention to names. There are lots of other things you should be paying attention to, lots of descriptions. For example, as soon as she goes upstairs, she sits in a comfortable, roomy armchair. And one question I sometimes ask is, well, why? Obviously, the comfort and the space has to do with her newfound freedom or what she believes. But why not, if it's about space, why not have her sit on a sofa? Why a chair? And I think what's obvious here is that her freedom comes from the fact that she's alone. No longer is her life there for two, but it's for one. A sofa is for multiple people, but the whole point is that her new space and freedom is because she's now has a life for one, just for herself. And I think a chair versus a sofa reinforces that. I think another is that she keeps looking out a window, but you'll notice that she never actually leaves the house. And I think that that's a really important way that Chopin uses the setting to suggest that she has these glimpses of freedom. But what we realize by the end is that none of that freedom is actually realized. It's the illusion of freedom, but she doesn't actually get to experience it. That's why she never goes outside. That's why she's looking out a window, not a door. Windows are really for looking, not for actually sort of getting out or escaping. Another thing you might notice, why would Chopin add what direction the window is facing? It's in the west. Why west? Well, in literature, we know that in the West, that's where the sun sets. And in literature, sunsets are a pretty stock symbol, sort of meaning the end of something. And if you think about what this story is about, it's really about the end of her life as Mrs. Mallard and the beginning of her life as Louise, as this new individual, or at least she thinks. Spring, right? If you think about the season, spring often is used to represent sort of rebirth. And again, she's being reborn as Louise after this life as Mrs. Mallard. She's sort of throwing off the sort of oppressive nature of marriage and experiencing her own identity. There are lots of others, related to the sort of washing. If you think about it, talks about the delicious breath of rain in the story. If you noted, that's what the narrator refers to. If you think about it, symbolically, rain or storm clouds typically suggest something negative, right? But here it's described as delicious, and you think to yourself, well, why would it be described as delicious? Why would rain be positive here? And I think it relates to, at least in some sense, the idea of spring, but also the idea of cleansing. right? The rain here is washing away, and it's washing away her old life symbolically and giving way to the new life. I think that also relates to when her husband finally shows up. One of the two things he's carrying is an umbrella. And I think that Chopin is being clever here, sort of symbolically suggesting that while rain represents the cleansing away of Mrs. Mallard's old life, the umbrella that Bentley Mallard has, represents the idea that he never actually did get cleansed or washed away. The umbrella there sort of represents that. And sure enough, when he returns, so do all the burdens of her life, which I think ultimately we're meant to believe kill her. That's a very, very quick take on a story that's much more complex. But I want you to be thinking about how these details that the authors include, especially details that you don't need to understand the plot, how they're being used to contribute to a broader meaning. Trust me, just as with advertisements or anything else like that, choices are intentional. And so it's really up to you to determine what those choices, first to identify those choices, but also to explain sort of what they're doing there. And with that, I will leave you to your reading for the week. As always, let me know if you have any questions or concerns.